Today, my wife and I are visiting Colonial Williamsburg, an amazing living history museum in Virginia that tells the early part of America's enduring story. Come along with me and my wife as we explore a history buff's paradise. That's coming up next.
Said I would be subtle and look at me. I'm making a show. You know it's illegal to have moss on your roof. It's a fire hazard. And when it dries out, as it is, in the summertime, and the spark from the chimney ignites it, well, the entire city will go up. That's awful. I apologize, friends. This is the house that I was speaking of. This is my mother's childhood home. My mother is a Jones by birth. And she grew up in and around the city, of course, primarily out on a farm outside of the city, but this were owned by my grandfather, Orlando Jones. My grandfather were a member of the house, and my great-grandfather, Roland Jones, was the first rector of Wooten Parish Church, and he is buried in the church just down the way there. But my mother, this house holds very happy memories for her. Perhaps not all happy. She was orphaned at a young age. She and my uncle, Lane. And her guardianship was put under the terms of her stepmother, for lack of a better term, her father's second wife. And of course, as you know, a guardian's responsibility, as it is my husband's just now for my children, is to care and manage the estates of those under guardianship, so that they will have something when they turn their majority. And that is why you must present your guardianship papers to the court on a yearly basis, so that it cannot be mismanaged. Unfortunately, my mother's guardian mismanaged their estates within the course of 1 year, and left my mother and my uncle with nothing from the vast Jones estate. This house was sold out of the family during that time to settle debts. And I think that my mother always misses it. It was sold out of the family before I was a glimmer in my mother's eyes. And it was during that time, once it was discovered what this person was doing to my mother's estates, that my uncle, Lane, sued for his emancipation. And my mother was a co-signer in that suit. My uncle was granted it, my mother was not. And she were forced to stay under the guardianship of this person for almost a year before that guardianship was finally released. But it was during that time that my mother was able to choose her next guardian, and she chose a man, a family friend named Graves Pack, out in New Kent. And it was thus that took her to New Kent, where she met my father, John Dandridge. And I think in many ways my mother left this city under a cloud of shame. She were a member of the great Jones family, of course. And thus she were having to leave the city with no property, no money, and the embarrassment of having to go through the courts to emancipate herself in her own situation. But as I said, it caused my mother to find my father. And I remember asking my mother when I was very young, as you do, what was it about father? Why did you choose to marry father? And of course, when we were very young, my mother would always say, oh, it was the fairies that placed us near one another. But it was not until I were widowed, when I asked my mother again, that she finally gave me the real answer. She told me that the most important thing about my father, when they first met, was that he saw her in her. He did not see the embarrassment or the shame that she left Williamsburg with. He did not see the size of her estate, but he saw her. And she said that that is something that you should always look for in a partner. And she said that when she were very young, being a Jones, of course, she were the prize of Williamsburg. that there were gentlemen from all over who wished to marry Francis Jones. And I did not experience that when I was very young, marrying Mr. Custis. But when I were the widow Custis, I became a show pony up for auction, my friends. But there were nobody on this peninsula nor entire colony who were not acquainted with the Custis fortune. And thus there were many very, very fine gentlemen who made their suit during that time. And each and every one, of course, saw what? The fortune. They did not see me. Sir, I believe you asked at the beginning of our stroll how I met George. And I told you that we would get to it in time, and thus is the time. Colonel Washington and I have known one another for years. Being a Washington and being a Dandridge, of course, we were of the same social level, but we parted paths. He to the military, where he earned the title colonel, and myself becoming Mrs. Custis. And it were about a year after my first husband died that we were reintroduced to one another through the kindness and deviousness of our friends who decided to play Cupid with us. A very dangerous game, I think. But it were our neighbors out in New Kent, the Chamberlains, who determined that the two of us should meet. And thus they forced it to happen. I grew up with their daughter, and Mrs. Chamberlain invited me to the estate, and she would not let me leave until Richard, her husband, returned back from Williamsburg. Whereupon he brought up a present with him, and it were in the form of a very tall, very awkward, very sick Colonel Washington. Colonel Washington had been in the city on leave from the military to attend to some personal matters with Dr. Emerson. Well, Mrs. Chamberlain reintroduced us and then saw fit to remove everyone else from the room. And I will say it was a happy reintroduction, for Colonel Washington had seen life on frontier in the same way that I had experienced life by losing my children and my husband. To the point where at our tender age, not many of our social circles could truly understand the gravity with which our situation was. But in reintroducing each other after so many years apart, we understood each other. And it was at that time where we realized that the two of us had exactly what we both needed in partners. And we very quickly, over the course of several meetings, determined that we should very much like to be partners for life. Sorry, friends. When you know everyone in the city. And so we were married again on 12th night. I was married first in May. And I remember when I was 18, the only thing I could truly think of was how high I could pile my hair on top of my head and which flowers would be improved. For my second marriage, I chose to marry on 12th night. The end of the Christmas season, the beginning of a new year, the beginning of new hope. For that is exactly what Colonel Washington and I needed for one another. And thus we have been married, my friends, for 10 years at this time. And I have to thank the divine providence for all of my determined nature, as my mother puts it. He has been kind to me in giving me not only one partner, but two. But I do beg him on a daily basis not to make me choose a third. My friends, I have one more place that I need to go that is off the high street if you are able and willing to join me. And there are places to sit should you need a bit of a respite. It's just behind this French.
Well, that's a wrap for this Colonial Williamsburg video. I hope you really enjoyed it, getting to see another part of this amazing living history museum. If you like this sort of stuff, check out my other videos. Check out colonialwilliamsburg.org to plan your own visit here, because it's so much cooler in real life than it is on film. Till next time, this is History Buff, TN Photobug signing out, and I'm having a blast with the past.